$900 million narcotics pipeline has just been exposed, Pete, revealing corruption and hidden routes across the American West.
More than 5,400 agents were mobilized in a single operation. 32 locations were hit at the same time in less than 1 day, and nearly 3.8 tons of narcotics were seized. Those three numbers alone were enough to show that this was not a routine case. It was one of the largest sweeps carried out on American soil in many years. But what truly stunned investigators was not only the volume of narcotics taken off the streets. Behind that network was a revenue stream capable of generating nearly $900 million each year. More than $82 million in cash were seized in just one round, and none of that money came from street-level transactions. It came from a system that operated like a legitimate business, running quietly for years, with almost no one noticing. The question was not why law enforcement finally uncovered it. The question was how a network of this scale and intensity could exist, operate, and expand inside the infrastructure of the United States without raising obvious suspicion for such a long time. 3.8 tons of narcotics do not move by chance. To handle that volume, the system needed stable highway routes, valid transport permits, legally registered companies, drivers with clean records, warehouses running around the clock, refrigerated units operating 24/7, fixed delivery schedules, and a long chain of people performing their legitimate tasks every single day. Most importantly, it needed a normal-looking facade so that no one had a reason to question it. Inside that environment, CJNG, described by investigators as one of the most dangerous and adaptable criminal organizations today, built a transport network embedded deep inside the legitimate commercial system. There were no loud confrontations or public acts of violence. The network was sustained through valid invoices, precise schedules, ordinary cargo lists, and transport routes that looked no different from any other logistics company on the American highway map. During the investigation, agents tracked more than 182 shipments each month, moving through at least 7 different states. On the surface, these were routine truckloads carrying mechanical parts or frozen food, with proper documents, signatures, and confirmations. But when the data sets were reviewed side by side, irregularities emerged. The same routes were repeated at the same hours, with near-perfect consistency. The shipments were heavier than average by 20 to 30%, and certain trucks stopped only at specific warehouses, places that had not been subject to random inspections for many months. All those traces led to a location that seemed harmless. It was a warehouse on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California. On paper, it was an ordinary logistics facility with no significant history of violations. The invoices appeared valid. The transport permits were complete. The drivers had no direct links to narcotics. Nothing made the site stand out among the hundreds of warehouses in the area. But when the data was analyzed more deeply, the truth began to surface. Some shipments were listed as auto parts, but weighed the same as heavy metal. Several containers left the warehouse at the exact same time on the same day each week for months, regardless of holidays or weather. And from this single point, routes branched into multiple states, forming a transport network far denser than any legitimate distribution center in the region. That was the moment investigators realized they were not tracking a suspicious warehouse. They had reached a coordination hub for a much larger system. It was tightly organized, built for long-term use, and shielded behind layers of legitimate paperwork. Bakersfield was not the end of the story. It was only the first place where the true structure began to show. And from that first crack, a federal-level investigation was officially set in motion. As data from Bakersfield was examined at a deeper level, investigators understood they were no longer looking at a single facility. The routes originating from this area did not support just a few unusual shipments. They formed a structured transport network spanning multiple states, operating on stable schedules and guided by detailed data logs. The timestamps, stops, and transfer points showed one thing. This was a system that had been tested, optimized, and maintained for a long period. Based on tracking data, authorities identified at least 7 states inside this network. Those states were California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, and Kansas. The selection of these states was not random. Each sat along major interstate highways, positioned at the crossroads of key economic corridors with large warehouse and distribution infrastructures. Every day, millions of tons of legitimate cargo moved through these routes. Only a small fraction of vehicles were inspected closely. Within that vast flow of normal commerce, the illicit shipments blended almost perfectly. The investigation did not stop at a single hub in Bakersfield. Agents identified at least 28 transport companies with direct or indirect links to the network. On paper, these were legitimate businesses with clear operating histories, contracts, invoices, manifests, and tax filings that appeared clean. Some companies had even been rated as efficient and reliable. That layer of normalcy created an almost impenetrable cover. There were no obvious signs suggesting they were part of a large-scale illegal operation. At the same time, investigators identified at least 14 mechanical workshops scattered across several states. They were believed to be involved in modifying transport vehicles. On the surface, these shops only repaired and upgraded trucks according to customer requests, which was a fully legitimate service. However, technical data and schematics recovered from several devices showed that many vehicles had been altered to include hidden compartments. These compartments were reinforced and disguised inside the vehicle frames. They did not appear in the official technical descriptions and could not be detected during standard inspections without inside information. What concerned investigators even more was not the facilities or the number of businesses involved. It was the signs of deliberate assistance from certain individuals inside the system. During a review of administrative approvals related to long-distance transport, investigators found repeated after-hours permits and priority authorizations issued to the same group of companies. There were no reasonable economic explanations. At least 3 local officials were directly linked to those approvals. In addition, signs suggested that at least 12 personnel from highway control units and border sectors were under investigation for skipping inspection steps for certain vehicles. Each person made only one small decision. They chose not to request a secondary check. They chose not to stop the truck. They chose not to ask questions. But when those small decisions repeated often enough, they created a safe corridor that allowed hundreds of shipments to pass through each month. The most dangerous part of this network was not only the narcotics or the money, it was the gaps in responsibility, where doing nothing became the key factor that allowed a massive system to survive. As the larger picture began to appear, federal agencies understood that they could not approach this case in a standard way. If they focused only on Bakersfield, the network would shift its routes, change its transfer points, and continue operations elsewhere. To truly disrupt the flow, they had to strike many locations at the same time, across multiple states, within an extremely short window before any information could leak. From that plan, a large-scale operation was created. It was later named Operation Desert Veil. For many days leading up to the action, thousands of agents from FBI, DEA, ICE, ATF, DHS, and local units were assigned and deployed to target locations. Each team had a specific task. Some were ordered to secure logistics hubs in California. Others were directed to hit mechanical workshops in Phoenix and Las Vegas. Additional teams monitored critical routes in New Mexico and Texas. At the same time, other units moved to seal off cache storage sites, operating under the cover of cold warehouses in Nevada. At dawn, when the order was issued, more than 5,400 personnel acted at 32 different locations across 7 states. At a cold storage site in Las Vegas, 2 trucks attempted to break through the gate as law enforcement arrived, but they were stopped inside the property. At a workshop in Phoenix, several individuals tried to destroy technical files related to vehicle modifications, but most electronic equipment was seized intact. Near the western border of New Mexico, a convoy of trucks was intercepted after turning off the highway exactly as the data had predicted. When the operation ended, 18 suspects lost their lives during confrontations. 73 others were taken into custody for further investigation, and 4 transport vehicles were destroyed after attempts to burn them to eliminate evidence. Dozens of trucks, containers, and mechanical devices were sealed. Hundreds of phones, computers, storage drives, and paper records were collected for deeper analysis. What stood out most was the near-perfect match between predictive data and the reality on the ground. The schedules, stop points, and load weights of the vehicles aligned with what had been gathered from Bakersfield. According to investigators, this confirmed that the network did not operate spontaneously. It relied on a system that was planned, monitored, and maintained continuously through data. As the sun rose after the overnight action, all 32 locations were under full control of law enforcement. For the investigators involved, this marked only the end of the first phase. What had been dismantled that night was mainly the physical structure of the network, the warehouses, the vehicles, and the personnel. The more dangerous components, including the data systems, long-term plans, and backup strategies, were still locked inside thousands of files, devices, and servers that had not yet been decoded. Operation Desert Veil delivered an unprecedented blow to the current activities of CJNG inside the United States. But it also opened a doorway into a deeper layer of the story. Investigators began to understand how this network was designed to survive, adapt, and even regenerate after major losses. What they uncovered during the data analysis phase went far beyond the earliest expectations. After the key sites were secured during Operation Desert Veil, the investigation entered a quieter but far more decisive phase. It focused on analyzing every piece of data and every electronic device seized. More than 200 phones, dozens of laptops, desktop machines, external drives, and multiple servers were transported to federal digital forensics centers. There, each byte of data was extracted to rebuild the structure behind the system that had just been disrupted. Inside a storage facility in northern Nevada, agents discovered a room reinforced entirely with metal. It did not appear in any legitimate business records. Inside the room was a row of independent servers with dedicated cooling and isolated power. These devices did not store contracts or invoices. They contained encrypted location data that displayed routes, stop points, and scheduled movements for dozens of vehicles across multiple states. As the files were decoded, investigators realized that each transport route had more than one fixed path. Most routes had 2 or 3 alternate plans. The system could redirect itself automatically if a transfer point failed to respond or became blocked. That meant even if one warehouse was exposed, the network could reroute in a short time without direct human input. The entire structure resembled supply chain coordination software used by large corporations, where every element was optimized to reduce risk and maintain a continuous flow. The only difference was in what these routes were carrying. Another major part of the network was uncovered at the Port of Oakland and nearby facilities. Containers were declared as industrial parts and frozen food. Behind false metal panels were 2.7 tons of methamphetamine, 1.1 tons of cocaine, and more than 640,000 fentanyl tablets sealed in heat-resistant material. All carried the same route code linked directly to the coordination system discovered in Bakersfield. According to investigators, this confirmed that the operation was not a loose chain of shipments. It was a controlled link inside a large centralized system. In Fresno, investigators also found an area used to modify transport vehicles. Several trucks had been altered with false floors, reinforced cavities, and disguised structures able to conceal up to 400 pounds of cargo in a single run. None of these modifications appeared in official vehicle records. During standard highway inspections, they left almost no visible signs. Alongside the physical infrastructure, a sophisticated financial system also emerged. At an office registered as a consulting company in San Bernardino, 31 laptops were seized. All were running accounting programs paired with encrypted data that used symbols instead of names. When these records were matched with transactions intercepted from intermediary platforms, analysts found that in just 6 weeks, the system had dispersed more than $14.7 million through small repeated transfers across multiple layers of intermediaries. This method allowed the activity to slip below anti-money laundering thresholds designed to detect large and unusual movements. At several cold storage facilities in Nevada and nearby states, pallets that appeared to hold frozen goods were actually packed with tightly compressed cash bundles. The total amount seized after inventory reached $82 million, but server data showed that this was only a small fraction of the money moving through the system. The remaining amounts had either been converted through digital channels or were circulating in locations outside the scope of the operation. What alarmed investigators most was not only the scale of what had been seized, it was what the system had prepared for its future. In a folder named with symbols unrelated to transport or finance, specialists found plans for 3 new transfer hubs in Phoenix, Riverside, and Albuquerque. The files included lists of potential contractors, warehouse locations under review, and detailed timelines for a 60-day rollout. Each stage was planned in detail, from renting properties to modifying infrastructure, installing equipment, and conducting test runs before full operation. This revealed a cold truth. The network was not built to exist only once. It was designed to recover, restructure, and return in another form, even if most of its current structure was destroyed. Interviews with drivers and lower-level personnel clarified this strategy. Most were hired through legitimate intermediary companies. They handled routine transport jobs and were paid like any other worker. They were not allowed to inspect the cargo and were not told anything about the organization behind the scenes. The system was arranged so that when one link failed, another could replace it almost immediately without disrupting the larger flow. This confirmed that the network did not depend on any single individual. It relied on standardized structures and procedures. When people were removed, the system could still function. When a location was shut down, another location activated. Its real strength did not lie in the people. It lay in the way it was engineered to keep operating even under the worst conditions. Another discovery inside the encrypted files revealed plans for geographic expansion. Instead of focusing on the 7 states hit during the operation, the system appeared ready to shift toward regions such as Oregon, Idaho, and Wyoming. These places had lower enforcement density, longer and quieter routes, and had never been central targets of large federal operations. They were ideal for a network seeking to disappear into the normal flow of long and overlooked highways. At this point, the investigation had moved far beyond an interstate narcotics case. What emerged was the outline of an organizational model capable of embedding itself into the economic system, transport infrastructure, and even administrative processes without drawing clear attention. This was not just a story about intercepted trucks or seized shipments. It was a story about how a distorted structure could blend into legitimate life so effectively that almost no one noticed it. The most unsettling part was not the money or the narcotics seized. The most unsettling part was that for this system to survive for many years, it did not rely on a single brilliant tactic. It relied on the fact that too many people had become accustomed to never asking questions. As evidence rooms were sealed and devices were sorted by case, federal commanders understood that they had reached the end of the visible portion of the story. The hidden portion remained. The blueprints, backup strategies, and expansion plans revealed one clear truth. This was not the final chapter. It was the moment when light finally reached a system that had existed in the shadows for too long. And the real question, not only for investigators but for society, was this. If a network this large could operate in silence for so long, how many other structures might be running out there on the very roads we travel every day without knowing? After weeks of data analysis, interviews, and comparisons with federal records, authorities reached a strategic conclusion. What had been dismantled during Operation Desert Veil was only the visible surface of a multi-layered structure that had existed inside the legitimate infrastructure of the United States for many years. The story of more than 5,400 agents deployed across 7 states, of 32 coordinated raids, of nearly 3.8 tons of narcotics, and more than $82 million in cash seized, became more than striking numbers. They became evidence of something more serious. A system within the system had been operating in silence for many years, with almost no detection. What investigators uncovered, from money to narcotics, to electronic devices, to expansion blueprints, and route registration data, showed that this was no longer a simple story of illegal trafficking. It was a fusion of technology, finance, transport, personnel, and gaps inside administrative systems. Each component looked legitimate when viewed alone. Each part had a reason to exist. That was why, for so many years, no one saw the full picture. What was even more alarming was not only the level of organization behind CJNG, it was the way the system blended into normal operations. It did not rely on one person holding absolute power. It survived through countless small choices made by people every day. It survived when a signature was placed without question. It survived when an inspection was skipped. It survived when a question was left unasked. When those small choices were repeated long enough, the irregular became familiar. That sense of normal slowly became a shield that protected a massive network operating behind the scenes. For that reason, the greatest meaning of Operation Desert Veil was not found in the volume of evidence or the number of arrests. It was in the warning the operation delivered. After the sweep, many processes had to be reviewed. These included the way after-hours permits were issued, the way warehouses were monitored, the way data was shared between states, and the responsibilities tied to sensitive positions inside the infrastructure system. Several mechanisms once seen as smooth and efficient were now viewed as gaps that needed to be corrected at any cost. Yet even with these changes, nothing guaranteed that the network would not return in another form. Data recovered from the servers showed that the system always planned one step ahead. When one corridor closed, another corridor opened. When one area became risky, a quieter area became the next transfer point. That was why this fight could not rely only on large-scale operations. It depended on making the system more transparent and less vulnerable every day. In this context, the role of the community was no longer something outside the story. Every individual, within their work and daily life, formed a link inside the larger society. When one person chose to ask an extra question, report an irregularity, or simply refused to ignore something that felt wrong, they created a barrier against structures seeking to hide. Not because they held power, but because silence was no longer the only option. The most unsettling part of this story was not how large a criminal organization could become. It was how easily it had once existed, simply because no one believed it was their responsibility to speak up. That was the clearest lesson left by Operation Desert Veil. A system can be exploited in many different ways, but it collapses only when the people inside it decide that the old sense of normal is no longer acceptable. If investigations like this matter, it is not because of dramatic numbers. It is because they force us to look at how society operates each day. And sometimes, change does not begin with the next major operation. It begins with something much smaller. It begins with a question asked at the right moment. It begins with one correct action among hundreds of silent choices. From those small steps, a system once designed to remain invisible finally begins to lose the shadows it depended on.